I'm here at ETSI Security Conference, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Patrick Donegan from Hardenstance to talk about nation-state threats and supply chain risk for the telecom sector. Thank you so much, Patrick, for joining me.
It's a great pleasure.
Could you please start by introducing yourself and your background in security a little bit, please?
Yeah, so I've been in industry for 30 odd years. The start of my interest in security came in around about 2006-7. In 2009, whilst working at Heavy Reading, the research arm of Light Reading, I founded a network security practice. Grew that quite successfully, and off the back of that, I founded Hardenstance, which has, yes, a specialism in telecom security, but is also a broader play cybersecurity analyst firm focusing on all enterprise security markets and, to some extent, consumer security as well.
And can you please expand upon your role as an analyst and kind of what that involves?
Yeah, so I basically cover the cybersecurity marketplace. I work with vendors and users to understand the challenges that each party plays, and I endeavour to bring the two together to some extent to help users solve their problems and help vendors and their partners develop solutions that are going to be better attuned to resolving those needs. Really.
And actually, how do standards and kind of some of the standards ETSI work on kind of come into this?
That is a massively interesting question because the telecom world is fabulous at standardization. And one of the things I found in my career over the recent years is to develop an appreciation of just how good the telecom world is at standardization, and by comparison, just how poor the broader cybersecurity world is at standardization. And I think the broader cybersecurity community could learn a lot from the telecom sector's the value that the telecom sector attaches to standardization, and the quality with which it does it, and the quality with which it adheres to it. So it's an interesting question because telecom really is a leader in standardization, and the broader industry can learn from it very much.
Okay, and then moving on to the talk that you were giving this week on nation-state threats. How has cyber threats from nation-states developed from your point of view in recent years, especially looking at telecoms?
So I think that there's the evidence of the last couple of years is that the propensity of nation-states to take more risk in their cyber operations, their offensive cyber operations, has increased. Nation-states are taking more risk than they were. Perhaps the most glaring example is the Hafnium attack sponsored by Chinese state-sponsored hackers on Microsoft Exchange. That was a major escalation in the risk that nation-states are prepared to take, because what the hackers did was to break in, and in convention with cyber norms, espionage norms, they exfiltrated an enormous amount of data. That's not unusual. It's what is done in the espionage world, cyber or otherwise. What was different is that on their way out, they booby-trapped the infrastructure of some of their victims, so that when those victims then went to explore and see what had occurred, it ended up in some of their data being depleted, disrupted, damaged, destroyed. And that is an escalation. And so the general trend is towards escalation. From a telecom perspective, I would say the trend is really one that people isn't reflective of how people talk about it. The main thing that's been talked about in recent years is the risk from putting telecom networking equipment in your network that is subject to Trojans being melted into it at the direction of a nation state. That's been by far the most popular discussion. But in actual fact, the actual threat vectors have been far more simple than that. They've been far more traditional threat vectors focused on vulnerabilities in enterprise IT, human vulnerabilities, social engineering vulnerabilities, where we continue to see nation-state threat actors having very significant success at exfiltrating sensitive data from telcos directly. That's enormously important. That's what's actually happening. But the attention is focused elsewhere, where actually, as far as we know, there hasn't actually been a great deal of successful threat activity, not that much.
Okay.
So the focus amongst politicians and the media has, I wouldn't say it's been in the wrong place, but it's been disproportionately focused on one threat vector where there are many more which are just as and probably more effective.
Okay, and how easy is it kind of to determine whether something really is a nation state threat or has been kind of carried out more by individuals or private?
So, in one sense, I'm the wrong person to ask. I mean, that's sort of somewhat beyond my pay grade. But in terms of the one either chooses to trust or not trust the agencies that are involved in making those determinations. So the FBI, the NCSC in the UK, and their equivalents in other countries. I choose to take those organisations at their word. So when the NCSC or FBI makes an assertion that this is a nation-state threat actor or this is a private ransomware gang, I'm minded to accept that verdict because I have trust in the belief in the determinations of those organisations. I'm not in the business of actually making those determinations myself, but I take those organisations at their word, rightly or wrongly.
And would you say there's a difference in the types of attacks that nation states do compared to individuals or organisations?
Let's see. Yes. So the best way to look at that is that the nation-state threat actors do tend to have the capability to design and execute the most sophisticated long-term attacks. Smaller organisations, smaller gangs don't have that sort of capability as a rule. But it's whilst that is definitely true, it's also a bit of a mistake to think that the only types of attacks that you do get from nation states are advanced persistent threats.
Yeah.
That's simply not the case. Nation state threat actors will use SMS, which is about as mundane and as ordinary as you can get. They use it on a regular basis. It's a very simple tool, but it's also very effective for achieving either various forms of misinformation or phishing links or what have you. So, the nation-state threat actors can be very much more sophisticated, but they don't only use sophisticated methods, and I think that's important to understand.
Yeah, to be aware of. And kind of now looking kind of the future, how do you see nation-state threats kind of developing now? Do you see them becoming more frequent or escalating, as you were saying earlier?
I'm afraid the direction is towards greater escalation at this point in time. And it would be nice to think that that trend towards escalation would subside. At this point in time, I don't see where that subsiding is going to come from.
Yeah.
I wish I could see that, and maybe it will. But the trends are poor. Let's hope that there's a better era of global collaboration and a de-escalation in nation-state hostilities that will facilitate that. But it's not looking enormously likely at this point in time.
Okay, and looking at kind of the other side of it about defending against these sort of attacks, is there anything nations can be doing or are doing currently to kind of specifically prevent nation-state threats?
So I think it's not as though there are miracle cures. It's just about basic good cybersecurity best practice. I think it was Curtis from the CIS in the United States yesterday. He said that the thing he worries about most is the security of water supply.
Yeah.
Because he said next to nothing has been invested in the security of water supply systems. So I think it's on the one hand, yes, some advanced defenders are working on the next generation of defensive techniques with AI and all the rest of it. Enormously important for sure, but when you get Curtis saying something like that to the effect that we've had next to no investment in the basics of protecting cyber in our water supply systems, well, actually, let's focus on doing some of the basics where we've been lacking the basics. That's every bit as important as the sort of AI arms race, if you will. Both are important, but important not to forget the former.
Exactly. So finally, just coming back around to something we were talking at the beginning, which was security standards in telecoms and ETSI security standards. How do these play a role in nation-state threats and defending against these?
So obviously, the work of ETSI and 3GPP in defining telecom and telecom security standards is enormously important in defending a telco's telecom infrastructure. Immensely important, and telcos do a terrific job of defending their telecom infrastructure, leveraging ETSI, 3GPP, and other standards. But what that world of telecom standards doesn't protect you against is your basic enterprise IT security.
Yeah.
And that is where telcos have been and continue to fall down. Most recently, Optus. That had nothing to do with the telecom infrastructure. That was a vulnerability in the security of the APIs on some of their web servers. So that is the vulnerability area. In terms of the ETSI standards world, that work is well done. It's generally well implemented. For the most part, not always, but for the most part, it's well implemented. The big vulnerability is the broader enterprise IT, where telco security is no better or worse than most organisations, and that ain't all that good.
Okay, I'm afraid we come to the end of our time, but thank you so much, Patrick, for joining me and sharing your thoughts on this.
Great pleasure, thank you.